When it comes to Japanese gaming fads that we in the West missed out on, it's not like we didn't get some of these games themselves, but they didn't leave that big of a cultural impact. A lot of things that were popular in Japan ended up also becoming huge international successes as well. Stuff like Space Invaders, Pac-Man, Super Mario Bros., Street Fighter 2, and Pokemon. But I want you to know that these games were more lucky to gain international success than you'd think. While most Japanese games from the golden age of arcades were worldwide successes, the first time Japan would be truly split from the rest of the gaming world would be with the release of Xevious. Now I know what you're thinking. Xevious? It was pretty successful over here. Everyone knows Xevious. By the way, I'm not calling it Xevious. But the thing is, while Xevious was a moderate success internationally and is remembered as one of the last big games of the golden age of arcades, it was a massive phenomenon in Japan. It was the biggest arcade game since Space Invaders. Xevious has been cited as an influence for a lot of Japanese game creators going forward, including Bubble Bobble creator Fukio Mitsuji, Rez creator Tetsuya Mizuguchi, and most importantly, Pokemon creator Satoshi Tajiri. I'd honestly wager that every Japanese game designer for the next 20 years, big or small, was taking direct influence from Xevious, even the ones you wouldn't expect. So it's a shame really that outside of its few fans, in the rest of the world these days, Xevious feels like it's just a punching bag for jokes about its repetitive music. But Xevious was an important step in video games, being a huge leap forward for the shoot-'em-up genre. While it wasn't the first scrolling shooter, being predated by Zaxxon, Defender, and it was heavily inspired by Konami's Scramble, it was the first true vertically scrolling shoot-'em-up and just a great game. Naturally, being a household name in Japan, but being just another arcade game in the rest of the world, meant that a lot of people missed the significance of this evolutionary step for the genre, and as it kept growing and evolving, everyone outside of Japan couldn't keep up. So shoot-'em-ups would become associated with being a niche genre only for the most hardcore gamers. While all of Namco's previous arcade hits like Galaxian, Pac-Man, Galaga, and Dig Dug were just as big of hits internationally as they were in Japan, Xevious marked a huge delineation point. The thing is, while the reason everything else I discuss in this video failed to catch on is pretty obvious and easy to figure out, I genuinely have no clue why Xevious failed to catch on in the same way that it did in Japan. The first thing you would be likely to blame is Atari, who distributed the game in North America, but it's obvious that they really wanted to capture the same level of success that the game saw in Japan, making full-on television commercials for the arcade game. They also distributed Namco's Dig Dug in the US, and it did extremely well. Shocking given how much of a quirky Japanese game it is. So it would seem hard to sell internationally, but they pulled it off. Meanwhile, Xevious isn't a domestically Japanese game like that. Its design has universal appeal. Heck, it takes place in South America. So I can't really blame Atari. It also wasn't that it came out too late. It came out almost simultaneously in Japan and North America. Another possible theory is one that people are going to get mad at me for even bringing up, and that's that maybe it had something to do with the North American video game industry crash. But that doesn't make any sense. That event is always blown out of proportion, so much so in fact that a lot of people nowadays like to act like it didn't even happen at all. It was only the console market that crashed, and it was only in North America. Computer games and arcade games were completely unaffected, and other arcade games released in this period did well. The last possible thing I could think of is maybe the home console ports not being as popular, which I guess relates to my last theory since the NES wouldn't come out until a year after the Japanese Famicom version of Xevious came out. The Famicom version was a smash success in Japan, selling out in the first 3 days of release, and releasing while the arcade game was still hot in November of 1984. Yeah, this game was so beloved it was still a big deal over a year after its initial release. Meanwhile, because of Namco's weird practices in the 80s, it wasn't released on the NES until around September of 1988, and it was ported to the failed Atari 7800 in 1986. It was an ancient game by those points. But regardless of what the reason behind Xevious's lack of cultural impact on the world outside of Japan could be, it was the game that really split the gaming industry, and this caused significant harm to the perception of the shoot-'em-up genre outside of Japan. It was once the biggest video game genre. Games like Space Invaders and Galaga ruled the arcades, and there were even quite a few Western contributions to the genre like Centipede and Defender. But after this game, shoot-'em-ups became known primarily as a niche Japanese thing, outside of the occasional European game. The release of Super Mario Bros. Also ended the genre's reign as the video game genre, and platformers became the #1 genre. People's minimal or straight up lack of Xevious experience made the evolving genre hard to get into down the line. Think about it. People could get into harder platformers like Castlevania and Mega Man, and they were allowed to thrive because pretty much everyone had played Super Mario Bros., so everyone knew the basics of the genre. Do you think people are going to get into a game like Blazing Lasers without Xevious being a universal prerequisite like that? Do you even know what's going on screen right now? So, if you think shoot-'em-ups are too hard to get into, maybe start playing Xevious and chronologically progress through the genre from there, because this is a great genre that deserves more love and recognition beyond its early days. Play the Famicom version though. The original is good, but that version is much better. The ship is faster and everything is easier to hit, and the Famicom version has cheats while the NES version doesn't. It's not as good graphically, but it's still the best version of the original game with the original map. But if Xevious doesn't do it for you, as it's a pretty simple score attack game, then skip ahead to some of the later beginner-friendly shmups like Xevious's sequels, except for the ones with Super in the title, Solar Striker, or Capcom's and Treasure shooters. This genre really isn't as scary as people make it out to be. It's just that its most important games past 1983 aren't ingrained in most people's consciousness like most platformers and fighting games and whatnot. Well, there is one thing about Xevious that I kinda failed to mention. You see, there was this thing in the game where if you bombed certain parts of the map, you could find hidden soul towers that would give you points, or special flags that would give you points and a 1-up. People began discovering these secrets and found that they could be found in the same general area consistently. Not exactly though. And it created this culture around the game where people were sharing tips and tricks on where on the map to find these secrets to try to get the highest scores. It was great creating this social culture around the game, as something that's kind of a flaw about Xevious is the fact that it's only an alternating 2-player game, when it could have easily have been co-op. But whatever, we have Xevious Arrangement and Xevious 3DG for that now, and that wasn't really a thing back then. This helped give the game a real communal aspect though, one unmatched by any game that came before besides maybe Pac-Man. Unfortunately, Western culture is a lot more antisocial it seems. The sooner we could abandon the social setting of arcades, the better. This is ironic considering how most of these successful Western games these days are very community focused, but I guess we prefer coming together to compete rather than to cooperate. So this aspect of the game went ignored. So we missed a core part of the appeal. All that people saw was a scrolling vertical shooter with neat graphics, and that was it. Now, this is a different section, so why am I still talking about Xevious? Well, the game's creator, Masanobu Endo, decided after its success to create a game based entirely around these secrets. A game that at first seems pretty normal, but after a while, players would have to do increasingly obscure things to uncover secret treasures that would help them progress. That game was Tower of Druaga, a maze game in which you play as a knight named Gilgamesh who must rescue the maiden Kai from the evil Druaga, and in order to do so, must progress through the 60 floors of his maze-like tower. I'd say the game itself is nowhere near as interesting as its impact though. This game was beloved in Japan, and yet another cultural phenomenon, as once again, a community would form around the game where people would share solutions to the game's puzzles with each other. And unlike Xevious and everything else I discussed in this video, this game wouldn't be released outside of Japan at the time because of these cultural differences. And when it finally did in 1997, it was met with a hefty bit of backlash and confusion. It is very much a product of its time and place, unlike the much more timeless and still enjoyable Xevious. But as you can imagine, this game had influence. Oh, it sure did have influence. See, despite this game being the one thing in this video that never released outside of Japan in its heyday, it's the one thing where every console gamer in the world still felt the impact of this game. If you haven't caught on yet, I'm going to give you a very good example of this game's impact.
There are parts in the game that are definitely not self-explanatory and are too hard to figure out. Take this dead end, for example. Would you guess that you're supposed to pass through this wall? How? You have to kneel down by it for like 10 seconds. Now still, that's not enough to make it so cryptic and hidden that we can't figure it out. Oh, please give us more for our buck and make it harder so we can wander around the whole game and exhaust every possibility before we find out. Guess what? You need to have a red crystal selected and be kneeling down and wait a little while before this magic tornado comes and takes you to the next part of the game.
Oh yeah. All of the cryptic BS in NES games, all of the stuff that you could only find out through Nintendo Power and guidebooks, that is all just the Japanese developers of these games trying to emulate the success of Tower of Druaga. This game is the one to blame. OG NES fans, please take your 40 years of needless frustration out on it. In fact, you know the game Takeshi's Challenge? I don't know if I have to introduce this game to you. It is one of the most well-known Japan-exclusive retro games after all. But this was a game spearheaded by Japanese celebrity Takeshi Kitano and created by Taito. This game is notoriously cryptic to the point that not even Japanese gamers liked it. But this is a game misunderstood by even the most savvy of game historians. It is very clear to me that this game is just one massive, intentionally bad joke that Takeshi Kitano was playing on Japanese gamers, as he thought all of the games trying to be like Tower of Druaga were stupid. It is so obvious, and once you realize that, you appreciate it more. It was basically making fun of the fact that these cryptic triggers in these kinds of games make no sense, and it takes it to its natural absurd extremes as a sick joke. That being said, it is a bad game, and in ways that have nothing to do with its cryptic nature, but this is the only video game I know of where I like it way more as an artistic statement than as a piece of entertainment, and it was definitely something that needed to exist. It is rare to find games that parody game design trends in an actual clever way beyond the surface level. Too bad it went past most people's heads. That being said, I think most games from the late 80s that had elements of Tower of Druaga in them did it in a more Xevious style way and or did a much better job at it, including Super Mario Bros. Think about it. Hidden items that can only be uncovered by fulfilling certain conditions, secret areas, maze castles. It clearly has the Druaga DNA in it, but it never gets in the way of the rest of the game like it does in Druaga. Except for the maze castles, which honestly got worse in Super Mario Bros. 3, which ended up being one of the last games to be so heavily influenced by Druaga. Now, Druaga obviously didn't invent the idea of games having obscure conditions that needed to be fulfilled for progression. That kind of stuff sort of existed in the early PC RPGs like Wizardry and especially Ultima. But Druaga was the game that influenced all of the Japanese developers to do this kind of stuff in their action games. But around 1989, people realized a lot of this wasn't actually fun, and most games didn't necessitate being designed this way, and this trend ended almost immediately. Tower of Druaga may be a game that's best left in the time and place from whence it came from, but it's a very fascinating game nonetheless, and while it may have helped spawn a lot of crappy games, it also helped inspire games like Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda, and its admittedly pretty dope music inspired esteemed composer Yuzo Koshiro to begin creating video game music himself, so a lot more good ultimately came from it. Alright, I'll keep this section brief as there's not a whole lot to this, but I literally can't make this video without talking about it. Dragon Quest first came out in 1986 and it did aight. It was the first Japanese RPG designed with consoles in mind. But then its sequel came out and that's when it really became a massive cultural phenomenon. People were hooked and impatiently waiting for Dragon Quest III to come out. The wait sent Japan into hysteria, and when Dragon Quest III finally came out, people lined up in blocks for miles in order to get a copy of the game. People got into fights, kids got bullied for not having the game. It sent the country into a frenzy, one not paralleled by any game anywhere else before or since, except maybe the first few Pokemon games. Naturally, Nintendo of America saw this and was like, okay, we need to replicate this. Because of games like Dragon Quest, video games were just as respected of an art form as films and books in Japan. Meanwhile, in the US, video games were still seen as just advanced toys, and honestly, they still kind of aren't respected as an art form. It's media. Let's tell amazing stories in this medium like movies do. Anyways, the problem was, it was 1989. They had to work their way up from the fairly dated first game, but they made it work by essentially getting it retooled. Unfortunately, when the game came out, no one cared. So they started giving away copies to Nintendo Power subscribers as a last-ditch attempt to recreate the same level of success, and it didn't work. No one wanted to play a slow game where you had to navigate through menus with an NES controller. If they wanted that, they would play games on a PC with a keyboard. That's the thing, the Japanese PC gaming market was really niche at this time and mostly targeted adults. Personal computers were expensive. Family computers were not. But in the West, the PC gaming market, while still more niche than the console market, was sort of where Western developers had become most comfortable, and more people could play PC-style games on PC. No one wanted to play PC-style games on console because they didn't need to. Ironically, it seems just now, nearly 40 years later, that the PC gaming market is finally overtaking the console market in Japan. When Dragon Quest III came over to the US as Dragon Warrior 3 in March of 1992, 4 years after its initial release, it was just a game. People weren't lining up on Times Square fighting each other for a copy of the highly anticipated next part of this blockbuster series. It was just another kid's toy for the Nintendo. And a huge part of that was because it came out so late. Really, Dragon Quest wasn't going to become a fad in the US like it was in Japan. The rest of the world didn't necessitate that games like this be made for consoles. Consoles were all about action. All of the deep menu-heavy games are for PCs. This same thing also applies to Japanese adventure games. These kinds of games were streamlined on console, which gave them some appeal outside of Japan, but not enough to really become mainstream. Also, most of these games were just released too late. That being said, As JRPGs became even more streamlined for consoles, the rise of CDs made these usually expensive kinds of games cheaper, and Japanese companies started to become more in sync with their international divisions, console RPGs started gaining more popularity, and games like Final Fantasy VII and Pokemon became just as big of a phenomenon globally as they did in Japan. Because they were super streamlined, and with international releases becoming more of a priority, they could strike while the iron was hot. In fact, before then, most European gamers didn't get JRPGs at all. So, unlike what happened with Xevious and shoot 'em ups, it's not really a bad thing that Dragon Quest never caught on in North America at the time. This might actually be the worst thing in this video. See, while Xevious's lack of popularity led to a whole genre becoming less popular, and it's kind of annoying how homogenized it has made the discussion of retro games made between 1985 to 1995, where 80% of the games most people talk about from that period are platformers, it's not that bad. Us shmup fans just get to enjoy our fun niche games in peace, and there's always something new to introduce people to. But I think this situation I'm about to talk about really shows how awfully twisted the narrative around that period truly is. See, you obviously expect people in the West to mostly talk about things from a Western perspective, and it honestly makes sense, and it isn't really that much of a bad thing. It represents the majority of people. But a majority of the popular games and game consoles from this period came from Japan. And a lot of the time, a lot of parts of Japanese gaming history that are important to gaming history overall are left ignored. Nothing represents this more than the situation with the TurboGrafx-16. Oh yeah, it was just some third-tier bonus console that tried to compete with Nintendo and Sega. It had like Bonk or something on it. Wasn't that a response to Sonic and the mascot trend? See, from the North American perspective, video game console history is Atari make popular console, everyone make console, market overflooded, video game industry crash, Nintendo save video game console market with NES, Nintendo dominate, Nintendo strong, Sega step in and challenge Nintendo, Sega sell better than Nintendo for a while, Nintendo's first real competition. The thing is, that's not what happened when you're looking at the full picture. In Japan, video game console history is, in 1983, a bunch of companies start making video game consoles. Nintendo gets most popular thanks to licensed third-party support, but then NEC, in collaboration with Hudson Soft, releases the PC Engine in 1987. It's a huge deal, and after a while, it starts taking attention away from the Famicom. Oh yeah, Sega made some consoles before the Saturn, I think. While the TurboGrafx-16 truly is nothing more than a footnote, the PC Engine is unfairly ignored by retro game fans, as it's just as important as the Sega Genesis, if not more so. This was Nintendo's first real competition in Japan. It sold 8 million units in Japan. That's more than what any Sega console sold over there. That's more than what the N64 and GameCube sold over there. It was also the first device ever that could play games on a CD with its CD-ROM attachment. The first one, I get into that in an old video I made. Kind of important, don't you think? And the library is actually really good and worth discussing. I think a lot of people actively want to avoid thinking about the PC Engine because it will change the narratives they've kept in their heads about Nintendo, Sega, and Sony. Sorry to inform you, but during this era, NEC and Hudson were basically who you think Sega was in spirit, and Sega was who you think Sony was in spirit. And a lot of the people who complain about the discussion around retro gaming being stale these days never even bother to actually talk about the PC Engine. While there are plenty of parts of Japanese video game history that get ignored in the West, the PC Engine gets it the worst. The PC Engine was absolutely massive, and some really important industry shifts happened because of it. Really, this situation is more annoying for how the console has become underrated and affected historical perspective, rather than it actually affecting the progression of games in the rest of the world at the time, because it honestly didn't. But the TurboGrafx-16 wasn't going to do well in the US. It had a terrible name, and with it releasing after the Sega Genesis, they couldn't stand a chance against how ruthless Sega of America was at the time. Maybe if it had released a year earlier, things would be different, but this was a console from 1989, trying to market itself mainly off of games from 1987 and 1988. And with how fast technology was progressing at the time, that wasn't going to cut it. Also, they didn't really have anything for the mainstream like Sega did with stuff like its sports games, Disney games, and Sonic. Ironically, things that couldn't help Sega sell the Mega Drive in Japan because NEC took most of Sega's markets first. Funny given that the opposite situation happened in North America, and Sega made tons of deals with athletes and dominated that market before NEC could. In Japan, the Mega Drive is remembered more for its hardcore games than the mainstream stuff that defined it in the rest of the world. And outside of that, a lot of the stuff that defined the PC Engine was shmups, console adventure games, and RPGs. Stuff that's mainstream in Japan, but like I've already discussed in this video, absolutely was not in North America. Another thing worth pointing out is that Sega's mascot platformer series was much more streamlined for mainstream audiences and was truly seeking to compete with Mario, while Hudson's wasn't. And I think that kind of sums up the whole problem with the TurboGrafx-16. It wasn't competitive. Honestly, the big takeaway I want people to get out of this is to play some PC Engine games and try to fix this narrative. These games are just as good as any NES, SNES, and Genesis games, and the console is just as important. Honestly, I'd argue NEC is more important to video game console history than Atari. Atari made one popular console, but after that, they just stumbled around and never broke any new ground. They just existed. NEC was truly groundbreaking, but most of the world's view of history doesn't grant us that perspective. PC Engine is dope. Spread the word. Two things that I don't think many would associate with each other are Sega Saturn and success. But just like the PC Engine, the Saturn was hugely successful in Japan despite not being such elsewhere. Ironically, being Sega's most popular console there, and one of their most iconic assets in general. It was so popular, a lot of younger Japanese gamers didn't even know they made consoles before it, except maybe the Mega Drive. In fact, it outsold the N64 over there. Over half of its worldwide sales come from Japan. It had the pretty huge advantage of coming out a few weeks before the PlayStation, and obviously it had amazing advertising. Actually, it had the best advertising. But I think what really boosted the Sega Saturn's success was the massive success of a game that they had released a year earlier. Virtua Fighter, the first fully 3D polygonal fighter. Now, you'd think this game would also be a success internationally, and it was, but it was another Xevious situation, sort of. It and its sequel practically had 2 whole years on the market to themselves, and they were really well liked. But it would be the release of another game on the PlayStation in 1995 that would connect with international audiences more. That, of course, being Tekken. The irony is not lost on me of the game with the Japanese title doing better internationally than the one with the English title. Tekken was more wacky and zany, and despite how wacky some of Virtua Fighter's characters were, it was a lot more grounded, and a lot of people saw that as boring. Tekken also actually put its story in the game rather than hiding it away. Like, a lot of people don't even think Virtua Fighter even has a story. But despite this, Virtua Fighter was still widely respected in Japan even after Tekken came along. This is gonna sound awfully weeby, but I just think Japanese audiences are a lot less shallow. They don't really need games to have bipedal bears and robots for them to want to play them. A grounded game is good enough for them. It's not like the game performed as underwhelmingly in the rest of the world compared to Japan as Xevious, but as soon as Tekken came out, interest in Virtua Fighter waned. But Virtua Fighter was a launch game for the Saturn in Japan and one of the main selling points of the console. Look, this system can play 3D games on relatively cheap CDs. Ironic. See, the Saturn's 3D capabilities were really good, and it was easily the best 2D machine on the market, beating out even the Neo Geo. The problem is that Sega didn't have a lot of foresight when it came to their 3D technology. See, the first two Virtua Fighter games use quadrilateral polygons rather than triangular polygons, and so did Sega AM2's other 3D games at the time. So the Saturn based its internal 3D hardware off of that. Yes, I'm very aware that I'm oversimplifying things. My point is that everyone was moving away from that, as triangular polygons, or tris, are just way easier to work with, and would become the standard. So, with most people not wanting to work with the Saturn's capabilities and not being able to port any games over because of this limitation, it was viewed as a good 2D system and a bad 3D system. And only a select few developers even got a good grasp of the system's 3D capabilities. That being said, in Japan, no one cared at all. So what if we were moving towards a 3D future? We can still make fun 2D games too. That's not how it was viewed in the rest of the world though. As much as people like to rewrite history and act like the minority was the majority, and most people weren't tired of 2D games and only wanted 3D games, and it was only companies like Sony who thought that just isn't true. The widest sections of the gaming public in the West were obsessed with technological progress, and anything that could be deemed outdated was either hated or ignored, or just not released because it wouldn't be worth the risk to just release for the 100 or so people at the time that would actually want to play it. So I think you can imagine how that fared for the Saturn. Just to prove my point, the console's release also coincided with a bit of a retro revival in Japan, as this era was defined by a lot of compilations, but most of these were stuck in Japan, and the rest of the world wouldn't see a sort of retro revival period until a decade later with stuff like the Wii Virtual Console. I think the system's failure internationally was just an inherent problem having to do more with its hardware not gelling with the international attitudes at the time, rather than it having anything to do with its botched launch. I think even if Sega had launched the system properly and it was cheaper than the PlayStation, it wouldn't really be able to compete against it because of that. I mean, Europe was extremely loyal to Sega, and the Saturn still didn't sell well over there either. But there was another factor that I don't think a lot of people like admitting. Sega's always only been known for one thing amongst general audiences. Ask any average casual gaming person to name 5 Nintendo games. They could probably give you a diverse list. Ask any average casual gaming person to name 5 Sega games. Yeah, it's 95% likely they're only gonna name Sonic the Hedgehog games. But in Japan, Sega's known for 2 things. Aside from Ryuga Gotoku, AM2's arcade games, especially Virtua Fighter and Space Harrier, and how epic the Saturn is. Not Sonic though. It's just not popular over there. Sega's success in the 90s, particularly in North America, basically only hinged on one franchise, and they never bothered to really try and get their other great franchises with loads of potential like Streets of Rage, Golden Axe, Phantasy Star, and Shinobi to reach that same mainstream level of success. Hardcore Sega fans love them, but hardly anyone else knows about them. The Genesis thrived in the mainstream solely off of Sonic, sports games, and Disney games, so the fact that the Saturn didn't see a proper Sonic game really didn't help. And even if Sega didn't botch the console's launch in North America, barely anyone really cared that much about Virtua Fighter, which was truly the main selling point of the console rather than Sonic. But a proper Sonic game wouldn't have helped anything. See, Sonic is a franchise made for a wide Western audience. The wide Western audience at this time expected 3D games. Just one problem. The console that was currently being manufactured by the company who owns Sonic just could not be made to run a proper 3D styled Sonic game due to its difficult to work with hardware. And the team that probably had the technical expertise to maybe pull it off were clearly burnt out from being forced to constantly stare at this face, making games that weren't popular in their own home country for 75% of their days for over 4 years straight, and wanted to do other things. It's wild how these days people are trying to push back against a certain narrative. You know the one, despite it just being true. Sonic had a rough transition into 3D is not a personal attack on anyone who likes the early 3D Sonic games, or even really a comment on their quality at all. It's just an inarguably true statement. Sonic had no real 3D games for 4 years because it was trapped on a console with 3D hardware that was too hard to work with. Then, when it finally officially transitioned to 3D, the game was 10% an actual transition of Sonic gameplay, and the other 90% was random experiments attempting to broaden the series' audience when these games were always made for a wide audience and appealed to them just fine. And if anything, most of these experiments either not being optional, being underbaked, or making up over half of these games put a lot more people off of these games. Sonic Adventure was not a good follow-up to Sonic 3 and Knuckles, it was a good Dreamcast tech demo, and that's where all of the positive reviews from the time came from. Once again, not to say anything of the quality of the game overall, but it's just true that it's not exactly an ideal or smooth transition to 3D. Even though the actual transitionary parts may have been alright, these unnecessary additions didn't help the game's reputation in the long run. And worsening the problem is that past that, they've still never made a game that could simply be considered a 3D Sonic game without any gimmicks. Mario didn't start doing random experiments when it transitioned into 3D. We got Super Mario 64 first, a game solely focused on making Mario work in 3D. Then we got the experimental stuff afterwards. Regardless of what you think of that game, that's a better way of doing things. Anyways, what was I talking about? Oh yeah, while the Saturn's failure ultimately led to the company's downfall that led them to exit the console business, it was a success in Japan, and the Dreamcast would have followed in its footsteps if it weren't for the piracy taking away from software sales and the really good cheap DVD player that was on the horizon. And yes, piracy does hurt systems. Hardware manufacturers make most of their money off of software sales. Why do you think the North American video game console crash happened? Why has everyone copied the precedent Nintendo set with their licensing practices for 4 decades? But the Sega Saturn is pretty rad. Unfortunately, they don't want to release a Saturn Mini because, according to Sega's president, they're not a retro company. They just have 24 IP that they've barely done anything with for 40 years. And it's not like a huge part of Sega's identity for a long time was doing new things the old-fashioned arcadey way. He also said that while Nintendo is jazz, Sega is rock and roll. Ah, I see, they're not a retro company. They're just out-of-touch dads talking about a rivalry that died out while they were still making consoles 30 years ago, comparing themselves to a musical genre that stopped being the zeitgeist for groundbreaking music and rebellion over 20 years ago. Yeah, sounds like a pretty apt description of Sega to me. Can you tell how I feel about this company? But I still love their games. Go play those. If you don't, Segata Sanshiro is going to beat you up.
Sanshiro, Segata, Sanshiro, Sega Saturn, Shiro.
Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope I didn't forget anything. Okay, I'll talk about it a little bit. The WonderSwan is probably the biggest system to be exclusive to Japan. Except the Famicom Disk System, if that counts. Here's the thing though, it's not really that interesting. Bandai made a handheld designed by Nintendo's Gunpei Yokoi and released it in 1999, after he passed away, and they later released a color version. It has a few good games on it, mostly ports, but it's mostly Bandai's licensed crap. It competed with the Game Boy Color, Neo Geo Pocket Color, and a little bit with the Game Boy Advance actually, and sold well. Handheld games are a little more popular in Japan for pretty obvious reasons, but honestly, it's not really that historically important. I could talk about the weird Rockman and Forte game, or the cancelled Final Fantasy III remake, but all of that's unnecessary. It's kinda cool, but looking at its library, it's obvious why it didn't release outside of Japan. Not really an important piece of history like the PC Engine, and not as interesting as the Saturn. And I find the things that did release outside of Japan at all to be more interesting to discuss anyways, because there's a conflict there. Anyways, if there is anything else you think I should have talked about, let me know. I would definitely love to hear your suggestions. I like making videos like this. They feel kind of important to make. Thank you so much for watching. Massive thank you to my patrons, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.